Hi, everybody. Welcome to our CSU Extension office, the High Altitude Food Preparation. We are so excited that you are here today. While you are all logging in, just take a quick moment, look at the comment section below, and just type in where you are watching from, what year you graduated, if you are a CSU alum. But either way, if you are coming in from YouTube or on StreamYard, or if you're here live, we are so excited that you guys are here today. I just want to take a quick moment too to also thank everybody who is a member of the Alumni Association. Without you, membership drives all of our events. So without your membership, we would not be able to host events like this. Also, I will put some information about membership in the comments in just a few moments, as well as our information about our license plates. So if you're ever in Colorado and you want to buy a license plate for your car, or you just bought a new car, you can click on the license plate link as well. But again, thank you so much for all of our members that are here tonight. Without you, we would not be able to do events like this. I will also put in the comments my general information. So if you are having a hard time hearing, or you having some technical issues, please feel free to shoot me a text message on my cell phone, or shoot me a quick email. I will be monitoring that throughout the entire program. Another thing too is that we have a wide variety of events that we have recorded in the past throughout the pandemic, as well as currently now, that are on our YouTube channel. So feel free to look at our YouTube channel. Just type in the CSU Alumni Association. You can see all of the events that we've had posted throughout the pandemic, as well as right now. And without that, I'm actually gonna go ahead and turn it over to Sheila and Sheila. But before, if you have any questions or comments for tonight, please make sure that you post the questions and comments inside the comment box at the bottom of your page. We will be reading these questions out loud as the presentation is going on, so that they can answer the questions throughout the entire program. If you have to log off early, that's okay. This is being recorded, and like I said, it will be on the YouTube channel tomorrow morning, so you can always come back and watch the presentation as well. So without further ado, I am going to go ahead and introduce tonight's guests, which are Sheila Gains and Sheila Beckley. Sheila Gains is from the Arapahoe County Extension Office, and Sheila Beckley is from the Weld County Extension Office. So without further ado, go ahead and take it.
Okay. Well, Sheila and I, the Sheilas, we answer a lot of calls and questions and emails about high elevation cooking. And the title of this program is High Elevation Baking. And because baking extend what we know from campus and what we learn in the labs out to the people of Colorado. So this is a perfect example of what we do in Extension. A program like this is not for credit, but it's knowing what we know with science around elevation and cooking, that we can put it in practical terms for anyone to use and benefit from. So our presenters again, Sheila Gains, that's myself, and Sheila Beckley, and we are family consumer science agents in our communities. So we have a question. We want you to answer this in the chat. The question is, have you ever experienced any of these high elevation baking issues? So put in the chat, have you ever had cookies spread too much? Just put cookies. If you had cakes or quick breads sinking in the middle, look like a bowling ball landed on them, put that in the chat. Just put cakes or quick breads. If your cakes were too crumbly and dry, just put in the chat dry cakes. Biscuits or muffins that were misshaped, put that in the chat. Maybe you had bread dough that overexpanded up over the top and you had like a mushroom loaf, or maybe it didn't rise at all. Or did you have pie or bread crust that was way too tough? So put that in the chat, and then we'll have a better idea of the kinds of problems that you've been experiencing. Yes, Corey?
One said yes to all. Another said yes, I make flat square cookies because I have to touch them apart.
Right, right.
Cakes sink. They're all coming.
Right, good, good. So those are typical problems that can be fixed easily by either measuring correctly or changing some of the measurements or increasing the temperature in your bakes, that sort of thing. All of those can be fixed. But I have to tell you, some of it is what you expect. We have several employees here at our office that are a lot younger than I am. And when they ordered some cookies from a caterer, when they came, I was complaining, saying, hey, this caterer does not know how to adjust the recipe for chocolate chip cookies. They ran out onto the pan so that you had cookie dough and then a chip, and then cookie dough and then a chip like a mountain instead of dough being around it. To me, that was a fail. These younger agents in our office are like, but that's the way my mom has always cooked them. That's comfort food to me. To them, that was the standard of perfect. So sometimes people's standards are different too. So as we go along, we'll talk about some of those things. So the objective tonight, at the end of this program, we would like you to be able to locate and use online tools to know exactly what your elevation is. No matter where you live in the world, there are some online tools that we'll go through so you can figure that out. We'd like you to be able to understand the role that some of the key ingredients in your bakes play in a successful elevation baking and how you can change those up. It's not an exact science, is it, Sheila? A little bit's art. It's trying it as an experiment and then trying it again, sometimes to perfect it. We would also like you to identify high elevation recipe adjustments that might be needed for better bakes. So we have some general guidelines for you, as well as successfully bake some products using these adjustments so that you'll have a better experience. So my job now, I'm going to move over to another camera and I'm going to demonstrate making a yogurt muffin that has not been adjusted for high altitude. And we're going to put it in the oven and we're going to see how it turns out. And then later on, Sheila is going to do a recipe that she's adjusted for high altitude, and we'll see the difference. So I'm going to start with, in my bowl here, and do not write down this recipe, because this one is supposed to fail, okay? You might write down the one that Sheila Beckley does, because this one has not been adjusted. So I'm going to start with 1 cup of plain yogurt, to which there's already a teaspoon of baking soda in my bowl. I want to make sure I get all of that yogurt because moisture does play a role in high altitude. So now that I've mixed that up, the baking soda was a base and the yogurt is the acid. We're going to get, you can see it's starting to get a little fluffy there. Then to that, I'm going to add my oil. I have 1/2 cup of vegetable oil. Mix that up. And I'm going to add my 3/4 cup of brown sugar. Could be dark, could be light, either one. But brown sugar does bake differently than white sugar does because of that extra molasses that's in there. It does affect the moisture of your base. Okay, so I let my brown sugar, I pre-measured it, and I left it out for just a couple of minutes so that I was ready to go. And now I have lumps. So I'm going to get in there and get a little bit more aggressive to get my brown sugar to dissolve a little bit. And I'm sure if you were making this at sea level, not as dry of an environment, you wouldn't have that drying out of the brown sugar within like 5 minutes of having pre-measured it. So mine's just a little bit lumpy, but it's going to dissolve. And then to this, I'm going to add 1 large egg. In Colorado, we need to make sure we're always using large eggs because we need that moisture from the egg. Okay, and then I'm going to add 2 teaspoons of double acting baking powder. Baking powder has both the acid and the base in it, and it will rise a little bit at first, and then it'll rise again when temperature hits it. That's the double part of the double acting. And now I'm going to add my flour. This is all-purpose flour. Okay, and then I'm going to add my salt and my cinnamon. I'm going to make sure those are well incorporated before I add my chopped apples. So this is going to be an apple cinnamon muffin. I'm going to switch from my whisk back to the spatula to make sure I get all the flour incorporated in. And now I'm going to add in my chopped apples. Fold those in. At this time, you could put another type of fruit, let's say cran raisins or nuts, that sort of thing. But again, don't write this one down. This is not the perfected recipe. This is just a test to show you what happens when you bake with an unadjusted recipe. So now I'm going to move my muffin tin over. I'm going to fill these. I put muffin lining in here, and then I lightly sprayed the top. Not so much wanting it into the foil liner, but wanting it on the top of the pan because I have a feeling these are going to rise up and touch each other and get stuck to the top of this pan. And I don't want to spend all evening cleaning. I love cooking, but I hate cleaning up. So sometimes in my house, they'll say, will you cook such and such? And I'll say, yep, if you agree to clean up. That's not my favorite thing. I don't think this is going to do the full 12, but we'll see. It's going to come close. The rest of the spatula. So Corey, what kinds of things are they saying that they're having problems with?
Let's go back. Cookies, cakes, bread dough.
Okay.
Quick bread sinking in the middle.
Yeah.
Cookies with lack of flavor.
Lack of flavor. I don't think that's a high altitude issue. Do you think, Sheila?
Well, at higher altitude, flavors tend to be muted a bit. So you might have to add a little bit more herbs or spices than you would normally do. And then, and salt, of course, enhances any flavor. So if you probably add a little bit more salt, not a whole bunch, that might help with a lack of flavor.
Okay, I'm going to put my muffins in an oven that I preheated to 350.
Also, we have one that came in that says, my house rules, whoever cooks doesn't clean up.
Hey, can you call my family? I like that rule. All right, so I've got mine in, and we're going to find out in 20 minutes how that worked out. And Sheila is going to start going through the slides.
Yep. So if we can move on to the next slide. There we go. So problems of high altitude food preparation has been going on, and CSU has been studying this for decades and decades and decades. And you can actually see that little shack over there. Inga Allison, one of the researchers at CSU, she actually would drive everywhere to test recipes for high elevation. Here, a CSU mechanical engineering professor actually built this chamber. It's 7 by 9 feet, and that's where they simulated various cooking conditions ranging from sea level all the way to 12,000 feet. Uh, Here you can see some of the people doing their research inside, and the person has to stay there the whole time while they're testing. And it's apparently really hard on the body, and you get, really fatigued doing this research. So there is actually a difference between the terms altitude and elevation. So the correct terminology to use is in fact elevation, even though if we go online and look at books, people actually use the word altitude. Now, altitude is the vertical distance between a reference point and an object. So I don't know if you can hear that. Sounds like a plane. So the difference of the distance from the plane and to where we are, that's altitude. Therefore, it changes if that plane flies or hovers over some other area that's higher or lower, then the altitude actually changes. Elevation is static, it does not change. It's the distance from global sea level to a local surface on the earth. So therefore, say your kitchen. The other thing that you might want to think about is the other thing that you might want to think about is, especially if you're doing canning, you might want to take a look at whatismyelevation.com to be sure of your exact elevation, because what they post as your elevation might be the elevation of the city or the capital of your county or whatever, and your particular kitchen might be a little different, so you want to be sure about that. Now, this graphic shows 13 towns around Colorado, and it shows us that all these different towns have different elevations. And in fact, you can see that at different elevations, the boiling point changes. So the higher the elevation, the lower water boils. So the boiling point of water changes, as well as the atmospheric pressure decreases as the elevation goes higher. You can see the PSI, or pounds per square inch. That's the atmospheric pressure there. So all of Colorado is actually above 3,000 feet. And so anything that's above 3,000 feet is considered high elevation. And in fact, at about 2,000 feet, you might feel you might need to tweak some of your baking recipes already. Over there in the picture on the right in the map, you will see the highest point is, let me just look at my notes, Mount Elbert. It's in Lake County. It's 14,433 feet. And the lowest point in Colorado is in Yuma County, 3,315 feet. It's a river called, I don't really know how to pronounce it, and I found two different pronunciations. One says Arikari, and the other one says Arikari. Well, I don't know which one's the correct pronunciation. Maybe some of you might know. Anyway, so even though we may not feel the atmospheric pressure or the decrease of that much, it does make a difference with our baking. And because the air pressure is less, there's the boiling point of water becomes lower. So what does that mean? We all know that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level, or 212 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level. But where we are here, which is about 5,000 feet, it's actually 95 degrees Celsius. It's 1 degree Celsius per 1,000 feet above sea level. So right here, we're about 95 degrees Celsius, or 203 degrees Fahrenheit for which the water will boil. Okay. Now let's take a look at this next picture. You've probably seen this and you're wondering, what in the world happened? Well, this particular bag of snack food was purchased in Denver, and then it was transferred to Leadville, which is more than 10,000 feet. And then you can see the decrease of atmospheric pressure made everything kind of get balloony inside, and it got all puffed up. So what happens when there's a decrease of pressure and when water boils a lot faster? Well, doughs and batters rise quickly. They overexpand. They result in a coarse texture. They can collapse. Okay? And then, of course, the water just doesn't really boil all the way to 212. So what does that mean when we are cooking, say, pasta noodles, right? Whether macaroni, spaghetti, whatever it is. It says in the box, cook for 10 to 12 minutes. And usually, even if you want al dente, it's going to be maybe a minute or so more than that. Because we're not really cooking at the boiling point of water at sea level. We're not cooking at 212. We're cooking at 203. So that's kind of one of them. That's a really obvious effect of that. The other thing that happens is that a decrease in relative humidity. So then it's very dry. Whether it's summer or winter, and definitely in the winter, it's even drier. It affects our cooking. What happens is that the flour is dry, so we're going to need more moisture in our recipes. When there's a very low relative humidity, when we're baking something in the oven, they dry out a lot faster. So how do we compensate with regards to the low relative humidity? The other thing that I have done over here, which I'll show you later with the adjusted muffin recipe, is I have sprayed the paper liners, or in this case, they're aluminum foil liners, because again, the tendency for everything to get dried up, when there's a moisture decrease, then the batter becomes more concentrated. And when it becomes more concentrated, then the ratio of sugar becomes higher. And then it has a tendency to stick to the paper. So normally you may not need to spray your cupcake liners, but sometimes it's just better to do that to be on the safe side. Okay, so the thing that I wanted to mention here is Sheila a while ago showed us a recipe, and it's a recipe that we found online, just as it is. And it's a good recipe for this particular lesson because there's a lot of things going on that's wrong in there. And the first thing you want to do with successful baking is to make sure that your recipe is reliable and tested. Certainly look at University Extension as well, especially CSU and other University Extension across the country for tested recipes. And then from there, do your adjustments. Because if we start from a recipe that's not really good to begin with, then it's really hard to adjust at that point. So at this point, we're going to talk about the demonstration of an adjusted recipe. So let's see, we're going to move over here to the other side where we have an overhead camera. And the first thing I'm going to do is to measure the ingredients. So a muffin recipe uses a muffin method or muffin mixing method, wherein you combine all the dry ingredients and all the wet ingredients separately. So we'll start with the dry ingredients, and it calls for, same as what Sheila did a while ago, a cup of flour. And what we're going to do is to spoon. First, we fluff the flour, and then we spoon it on the spoon it in the cup like this. Kind of overfill it a bit, and just scrape off the excess. Okay? And then to which we will add half a teaspoon of baking powder. So that's a decrease from 2 teaspoons. So this particular recipe was not a good recipe, so the adjustments are drastic. If you're working with a good recipe, then your adjustments will be pretty minimal. But this one, we chose a drastic recipe, so you can see an absolute fail. So, but anyway, half a teaspoon of baking powder, a quarter a teaspoon of baking soda. So the original recipe was a teaspoon of baking soda. And I'm just going to use a quarter, and I'll talk about the ratios in a bit. And then a 1/4 teaspoon salt.
And Sheila, we have a quick question too.
Yeah.
The question is, and maybe we want to reiterate it so people can hear it on the mic, is are there any different adjustments if using gluten-free flour for recipes?
Yes, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Gluten-free recipes where you use gluten-free flour, and usually that's based on rice flour and some other sort of gums that they use in there. You don't have any gluten, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Okay, so it's 3/4 cup of brown sugar. This particular recipe is a bit high on the sugar. It's the same ratio as making a yellow cake, because the amount of sugar is a little bit more than the amount of flour by weight. So it's a bit on the sweet side. So I think those are, oh, okay. 1/2 teaspoon of cinnamon. Okay. So then just mix everything together. And it's important that you want to mix your dry ingredients together so that you're assured that all of your leavening agents, which are your baking powder and baking soda, dispersed as evenly as you can. And generally, if I'm going to count myself, it takes me about 50 stirs for about this amount. Okay, so that is done. And then we're going to combine our wet ingredients. For the wet ingredients, we have 1 egg. Here. Okay. And then a 1/4 cup of oil. So generally speaking, I was going to use this actually as my mixing bowl. This one?
Yeah.
Okay. That's all right. I can use this one. Just transfer that egg there. Okay. Make sure you're looking down so it's level. Okay. So that's a 1/4 cup of oil, which is half of what it was before. Just generally, what I'm trying to do now is basically switch the recipe completely into what is a traditional muffin recipe, where the ratio is 2 parts flour, 2 parts liquid, 1 part egg, and 1 part oil. Okay, so I always mix my dry ingredients so that I can use the same whisk for the wet ingredients. Okay, so by the way, I haven't tested this recipe, the adjusted version. So we'll all see if, based from what I know, it's going to work. And if it doesn't work, goes to show that sometimes we really have to do multiple tests, maybe a second test or a third test. To get to what we want. So I have not adjusted the sugar because I feel like the author of the recipe really wanted this muffin to be a little bit on the sweeter side, not your traditional recipe, but this sweeter kind of muffin. So I did not change the amount of the sugar. Okay, so here we are.
How much yogurt are you putting in there? Half a cup?
Yeah, half a cup. So
The
I
original was a full cup.
was a full cup, yeah.
So I basically changed the recipe so it fits the traditional muffin ratio, except for the sugar, which I kept because that's what they wanted, more or less. Okay, so that is done. Then we'll just combine. Okay, wait. Thank you. The dry ingredients and the wet ingredients. Once it gets close to being mixed, then I'm going to add the apples. This is the add-ins. And you can use any other kind of add-ins you want, dried fruit, nuts, and so forth. And just kind of fold it in. So this is going to be a little bit thicker than your normal because it's yogurt for one. And if you use more like buttermilk or milk, then it won't be as solid. Okay. Then we're just gonna put it in. So for a muffin, just like what Sheila did, you want to fill it up about 2/3 full or 3/4 full, as opposed to a cupcake where you generally put maybe just half full because you want it really nice and flat. A muffin, generally, you want it to be kind of bulging. Yes?
How much chopped apple do you use?
This one was a heaping half a cup.
So half a cup of banana.
So we'll see if I put in a pretty small amount of leavening agent, which probably, in hindsight, maybe I should have increased it a bit because we have some add-ins. But I'll explain that in a bit here. Okay. So the original recipe says bake the muffin at 350 degrees Fahrenheit. That's actually, if you want a muffin, a traditional muffin wherein it's kind of bulging, you actually want to bake your muffin a minimum of 400 degrees Fahrenheit because you want the edges of the muffin to set. And then it will prevent the edges from rising. And then what's in the middle will now kind of burst a little bit on top. And if you want that traditional muffin appearance where it's kind of like raised on top, then you want to cook it actually a little bit higher to set the structure a bit faster. Okay, so that is done. So this one I'm going to bake in the other oven, which is set at 425 degrees. And I'm going to set the timer for 15 minutes. Okay, and thank you very much. And I think we're going to move on to the next bunch of slides.
Oh, it looks like I forgot to set my timer. I put it for 20, but I forgot to hit start. Does that ever happen to anybody else?
It happens to me all the time.
So I'm just going to peek in, see how they're doing. Yeah, they've got a few more minutes yet. Okay, so Claudia, will you tell me in about 5 minutes maybe? I'll check on them again. So Sheila was talking about what she did to adjust that recipe. This was the first time through. It was a bad recipe to begin with. So it may take a couple of adjustments. Like she said, well, I used yogurt. Maybe I needed to add a tablespoon or 2 of milk to that. We'll find out. It didn't make the full 12 either. Mine made, I think, 11, and yours made 10, just because it's a little bit different. But it is a process to get a recipe that you really like. So once you've written it in the margins of the recipes, what you did, what you think you want to adjust next time, once you get it perfected, then that's the important one to write down in the family recipe book. Because sometimes it's hard to find things that are adjusted for altitude. So we're going to talk about the ingredients and how they affect high elevation baking. But first we want to talk about safety. Do remember that raw flour as well as raw eggs can be a problem. They can have salmonella or other bacteria. So it's really important not to taste raw dough of any kind, any raw dough, cookie dough, any kind of batters. And as you're working with them, always wash your hands. When you've been working with raw flour, people understand eggs, but I don't think they understand quite some of the risks involved with raw flour. Always wash your hands and always wash your utensils after you've handled either eggs or flour, and fully cook it before you taste. So when you bake at high altitude, things that are going to affect your bake are the ingredients themselves, and we'll go through those. And it's also temperature. Sheila Beckley was talking about that, about how she set the temperature up a little bit higher in her oven to get that muffin to raise. And we also know with cookies, if we don't set the temperature high enough, it gives them time to spread instead of setting. And then it's time, because obviously if you change the temperature, you need to change the time as well. So here is a perfect example of a recipe that was not adjusted on your left. These are muffins or cupcakes that came out and over because there was too much leavening at our high altitude. They came up and over and they did not set their structure. Once it was adjusted for altitude, not only with the ingredient proportions, but also the temperature in the oven, what you see on the right there, that is really what we're going for in these cupcakes or chocolate muffins. So the ingredients that we most often need to reduce to have a good bake at high altitude are the leavening agents, and that would be either the baking soda or the baking powder or both, but we're talking slight amounts. The sweeteners such as sugar or honey, and the fat. Now, reducing the sugar and the fat just make products healthier. So I think it's a win-win to actually be baking at high altitude. You can make some healthier items. So the function of those leavening agents, they create pockets of gas or air in all of your baked goods, regardless of how they come about. And you could use things like yeasts. Oftentimes at high altitude, we say do not use rapid rise yeasts because it's too rapid and we don't get flavor development. You can get the rise in your bread as long as you have enough moisture in there to counteract how dry the flour is. But if you don't have enough time for the yeast to work, you're not going to get that same wonderful yeast bread flavor. Also, baking powder could be one of those leavening agents. Again, baking powder has the alkaline and the acid both in it, and it usually does a double rise, a little bit at first when you mix it and a second one when it hits the heat. There's baking soda, but if you use baking soda, you need to have an acid, whether it's sour cream or buttermilk or something in that recipe that creates that. Remember when you did volcanoes in high school or junior high or even elementary school where you put the baking soda and the vinegar together? That's what's happening in your recipe. Or beaten eggs. When you think about meringues or folding in beaten egg whites into an item, that sometimes is the leavening agent. And then we have steam as well, little pockets of water inside of, let's say, a flaky pastry that are going to steam up and create that flake in the pie dough. Yes. Oh, 5 minutes. Oh, I need to go check. Let's check to see if these are done. Okay, give me another 2 minutes. I think they look a little bit damp still in the center. So the leavening agents, you can see here some pictures of some different quick breads here. So when the leavening agents happen too fast, they bubble up and they have large pockets, and then those pockets collapse. So you can see the very bottom quick bread there. That one's got the dip in it. And that might be what some of you are talking about that you're getting with some of your quick breads, whether it's banana bread, carrot bread, zucchini bread. The one in the middle, they tried to adjust it just a little bit, but the one on the top really is perfection. They adjusted it a second time. So when it rises too quickly and the structure isn't there, it falls on itself. And we can adjust for that by reducing the leavening agent, increasing the temperature of the oven for a quicker bake, or sometimes even changing the flour we're using for a little bit stronger flour. Ingredients such as sweeteners, those we reduce as well. The function of those sweeteners is for flavor, but it's also for color. Without any sugar there, we're not going to get a lot of browning. It also helps the texture. It makes it a soft texture, as well as that sugar attracts water, so it makes them more moist. And it does provide food for yeast if you are leavening with yeast. So examples of sweeteners would be sugar, honey, corn syrup, brown sugar, molasses, or maple syrup. So any of those we usually reduce just a little bit. Those sweeteners, they do attract liquid to them and they do evaporate. So sometimes you'll notice in your bakes that you'll end up with like a sugar coating or a hard crust, which is kind of sugary on top, because they get more concentrated, as Sheila was saying. If something's baking and it was a little bit dry to begin with, it becomes more sugar concentrated in the bake. Okay, so we're going to check that bake again. I think it's probably ready to turn out. So I'm going to turn off the oven. And I'm going to take these out. And we're going to switch to the camera that's the overhead. And I'm going to show you what happened with the unadjusted recipe. You'll notice that they came out over. Good thing I put a little baking spray on this pan. They're touching each other. And I don't know if you can see it. I'll move it around so you can see the angles. But can you see that little dent in there? Okay, so they overrose. There wasn't enough structure there, and they fell on themselves. Is there anything you want to say about this?
Yeah, absolutely. And when it's a little bit cooler, then we can take a look at what's going on inside as well. Definitely, without adjustment here, you can see it has collapsed. It's absolutely.
It did exactly what we wanted it to do.
Does it taste okay? It tastes fine. It's a bit greasy though. The ratio of the oil is pretty high, but it is kind of moist and sweet. Tastes fine, but not very nice to look at, I guess.
And if your kids grew up eating this kind of a muffin, this might be their comfort food. And if you make them correctly, they might say, "What's wrong with your muffins, Mom? We always had a dent in the middle where we put the jelly. Where's the dent for the jelly, Mom?"
Right.
So, but that would we consider a fail. Okay, so we're also talking about fat, and as Sheila had just said, sometimes when there's too much fat, it also affects the structure, so it's more weak. The function of the fat in there is to contribute to flavor, obviously, particularly if you're using more flavorful fats like butter or oil. It adds moisture and mouthfeel, and you can get too low in fat, and then they're just not satisfying to eat, and they have a strange mouthfeel to them, kind of dry. But it also stops the gluten from developing, and we need a little bit of gluten there for the structure so they don't fall on themselves. So some of the examples of fat are shortening, cream. In this case, we use 2% yogurt rather than non-fat because the recipe didn't specify whether it was non-fat or a full fat, so I went kind of in the middle, 2%. It could be shortening, cream, oil, lard, butter, or margarine. So fats, again, tenderize the dough, and in this case, it's a little too tender. It also sometimes can help leaven things. Like if you've ever made cookies where you cream whatever the fat is with the sugar, you're actually incorporating a little bit of air in there. So they can help with that, to help leaven it by putting air in with the fat. And they add moisture and moisture retention. Yes, Corey, you have a question?
Yeah, it says often our cakes test as done and don't sink until they come out of the oven, not cooked in the middle either. Right.
So it would be worth, if that's happening to you on a regular basis, I would certainly adjust the margins on your recipe, the amount of time, increase the time a little bit, maybe by 5-minute intervals. But I would probably invest in a nice food thermometer so you can test and see when a cake really is done. And there's a wonderful chart. I'm trying to remember where I got it, whether it was the American Home Bakers Association or King Arthur Flour. One of the two of them, or maybe both, have a great chart that tells you what the done temperature of bread is, cake is, that sort of thing. So you'll know, you can temp it and say, oh, I need to put it back in, because you're right, it does look done from the outside, but then later it falls. So a good thermometer would be a good investment for that. I usually use the finger test. Does it spring back up when I put my finger on it? But if that's not working for you, I would invest in a thermometer. Yes, Corey.
Also, somebody else just said on StreamYard too that there's more room for frosting.
Oh,
I assume that's with the dip.
in the dip, particularly cupcakes, right? Particularly if it's cream cheese frosting or something really yummy like that. Okay. So one of the ingredients too is flour. So flour provides the texture and the form, and Sheila's going to talk a little bit about gluten-free baking in a few minutes. So it gives it that structure, and it also adds a little bit of flavor to your baked goods depending upon what kind of flour you use. So examples of flour would be all-purpose, bread flour, cake flour, pastry flour, whole wheat, self-rising, which we usually don't recommend. I know they use it a lot at lower elevations, but self-rising already has the baking powder put into it, and we want to control that. We don't want it already in there. So usually we don't recommend that. Rye flour, and then gluten-free or specialty flours. And as you can see from this slide, each of these types of flours has a different protein content, and that protein usually comes from gluten. And the higher the protein, the more gluten, the more structure to it. So you'll notice here we've got, starts on the left at cake flour, having 5 to 8% protein. And that's used for things that are super soft. I, at high altitude, have never really used cake flour. I don't see that it's that helpful. I always start out with all-purpose. But pastry flour might be helpful in pastry. And I think when Sheila Beckley gets up, she can talk about this a little bit more from her perspective, about what kind of flour to use in pie doughs and that sort of thing. I always use all-purpose. But you can see the protein content there. And as we go farther to the right, we have more protein content, so more structure to it, all-purpose, and then whole wheat flour, and then ending with bread flour. And when you're doing bread machines and things like that, sometimes we even add gluten to it to make it even higher protein than that 12 to 14%. Different brands have different protein levels, so you can look at the package and it'll usually tell you on there what it is. So if you're doing breads that you're going to actually want to develop the gluten, start with a higher gluten protein flour. Yes, Corey?
There's another question that just came in. It says, do dark metal pans versus light metal pans versus glass pans make a bigger difference at higher altitude?
They do. Sheila, do you have some information on that? Is it later on or?
I don't think it's anywhere in the slide about the pan.
Okay.
If you want to go ahead and start with it. The difference between pans are, if it's dark, then you'll just get a darker crust wherever your batter or dough is touching. That will get darker, as opposed to if you're using a pan that's very light in color. If you're using a pan that's aluminum, which is a good conductor of heat, then it will also give you a nice crust. If you use metal, for example, then stainless steel, then not as good of a conductor of heat. Then you may not have the however much crust that you want. If you want like really good crisp crust or whatever, then stainless steel is not going to give you that. For glass is actually, it retains heat, but not necessarily actually a very good conductor of heat, in that it doesn't really transfer as high of a temperature, for example. The advantage of glass is, of course, people, are thinking about, well, some of these nonstick pans, some of the nonstick coating might get into the food, and they have health concerns about that. In glass, they don't have that much of a concern. And of course, the advantage of glass is you bake it and it's nice enough to serve with. So that's the advantage of that. But definitely glass is not the best conductor of heat.
Thank you.
Anything you'd like to add?
I was just going to say too, we invested in some of those double like insulated cookie sheets, but at high altitude, we don't use them anymore because we turn the oven up so that our cookies don't spread, and we're just defeating the purpose of using a higher temp oven by using an insulated cookie sheet. So we just use a nice flat one sheet of metal instead of the insulated. Do you have an opinion on that?
Okay, well, I've never actually used an insulated type of baking sheet. Is the purpose of that is to prevent the bottom from getting too brown too quickly?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can see that.
But then they spread at a high
Uh,
altitude. So
Okay.
yeah, there's only certain ones we use with that. Corey,
Okay, I've
did you have
never
another
used
one?
them before.
Yeah, just another question that came in, but I think this one's more about flour. It says, what about high altitude flour?
High altitude flour is a brand. It's not a protein content. It's not guaranteeing that it was made for high altitude. It's a brand of flour. I would look on the sack and see what the protein content is and compare it to that last slide where we were talking about protein content. So as far as I know, high altitude flour is a brand name. It's not talking about protein. I would go with a bread flour, or if the brand that you get that's high altitude flour has something similar to bread, you might be able to use that. But otherwise, no advantage to that. Okay, so another slide on flour here. We use it to make breads, cookies, cakes, sponges, angel food cakes. Flours tend to be drier at our altitude and absorb more liquids. So particularly if I'm making yeast spreads, if it says, have you ever noticed if you're making yeast spreads, it'll say not 6 cups of flour. It'll say 4.5 to 5 cups of flour or 5 to 6 cups of flour. And that's because every single day the flour has a different moisture content. So at high altitude, the key to getting a good rise is not having too much flour in it. If you put too much flour in, it's too stiff. There's not enough water to make the yeast do what it needs to do and give it room to grow. So what you'll do is if it says 5 to 6 cups of flour, stop at 4.5, mix it really well, develop that gluten so it's not sticky. Then at the very end of your shaping and that, maybe go up to 5. Try not to get that 6 cup of flour in there. Try really, really hard to stop yourself from putting it in, and you'll have a nice rise. Okay, and then gluten-free cooking. I'm not that familiar with it. Sheila, do you have anything to say about that one? It does act differently because you don't have the structure of the gluten, of those proteins in the gluten. So you're adding structure by adding other things like what, gums and starches and
So I'm not very experienced with gluten-free baking as well, but from what we understand about it is there's no gluten in it. So you wouldn't need it if you're making bread, as long as you would need a regular bread made out of regular wheat flour, for example, because when you need something, you're working out the structure, the gluten and everything, but with gluten-free flour, there's no gluten to work. So once it's mixed, it's already done. Okay? The other thing is it's always going to be very soft. So whatever the recipe is, especially if it's from a reputable source, you just keep it as is. You wouldn't want to add more gluten-free flour, which is usually rice flour, because it'll end up being very dry. It's really, if I've worked with some pizza crusts before from a commercial producer, and they're very soft. They're really very soft, and you just kind of work with them very delicately, as opposed to just rolling your rolling pin with a pizza crust like this or pizza dough. You wouldn't do that. You're just very gentle with it, and because it's just a different structure altogether.
But I would say that all of the ingredients that go into a gluten-free might have the same problem with being dry, right?
Yes.
Drier at higher altitudes.
Mhm.
So you might have a little bit of extra, whatever the liquid is, like a tablespoon or two on the side, to throw in if it seems too dry. Okay. Thank you. And then again, the ingredient we've talked about a lot is liquids. So the function is to contribute to the moisture. It hydrates your proteins and your starches. It actually helps your leavening agents get started. If you've got baking powder or baking soda and you add some citric acid to it and they're both dry, nothing happens. You have no chemical reaction. It requires those liquids to have that reaction happen. So it's very important. Liquids may need to be increased slightly. I always have some extra on the side, a couple tablespoons, maybe even up to 1/4 cup. So examples of your liquids in a recipe would be water, milk, even eggs. Like I said before, always cook with the largest eggs you can in Colorado. It adds structure and it adds moisture. Could be cream, buttermilk, could be beer, broth, juice, lots of different things, or even butter or margarine could be considered a liquid if you melt it first. But I'd be careful substituting any liquid for one of those fats. I probably wouldn't put that in the liquid category for most recipes. So as elevation increases, as Sheila had said, water boils at a lower temperature, which can cause a faster evaporation, so we have less moisture in it. We have an increased concentration of sugars, can result in baked goods that are sticking to the pan, and the texture becomes dry and crumbly. Also at high altitudes, things like salt and seasonings, such as herbs and spices, sometimes you can't taste them as well. And I think Sheila talked about that a little bit at the beginning. You may have to add just a little bit more because as elevation increases, we don't taste that quite as much. So here Sheila's going to come up and do the next section, but let's go to this overhead camera here and look at, and do you want to describe what we're seeing here?
Yeah, so here we have your original recipe as is. And this one is where I adjusted it. It looks like I didn't put in the exact same amount on each one. It would be nice if you used one of those ice cream scoops so that you see there's a lot more here and a lot less there. But I'm going to go ahead and get one of them and see how they look like on the inside. So here's the camera. So let's take a look inside. Looks okay. It's still a little moist, but it really, recipe adjustment, as Sheila said, is also partly art because it really depends on your personal preference, right? And if your personal preference is kind of richer, more moist, more sweet, less sweet, more dry, more firm, softer, whatever it is, then you kind of have to adjust it according to your own preference, which we will talk about in a bit over here. So as you can see, it looks fine. It looks okay to me, but we'll have everybody here try them later and see what they think. Wish you could be here and so you can actually try them too. And then let's take a look at this one over here. So if we look at the difference in the texture between the two, you can see that the texture over here is more coarse. There's really bigger holes, like the crumb is, I don't know, where is it showing? Okay. The crumb over here is just a lot bigger, as you can see, because again, we don't have enough structure in there. Okay. All right. I would imagine this one will be more moist, but personally, I decreased the oil in half because I thought it was too oily for me. Because I like to eat my muffin with butter and jam, This, you couldn't butter it. I mean, it'll be like grease at that point, right? So again, it's kind of your preference. Okay.
Corey's got a question.
Yeah.
So the question that just came in a couple minutes ago, I think it might be for either of you. It says, what about substituting applesauce for oil?
Yeah, you can do that to increase the health benefits of a muffin. It works in muffins and quick breads to substitute the oil for, substitute the oil for either applesauce, or if you're doing something chocolate, you could even do pureed prunes, something like that. But from experience, I do know that then they stick to the liners more because you don't have any oil in there. So if you do 100% swap out, they will not have the same freshness day after day like the ones that have oil in it because they'll dry out. There's no oil there. They stick to the liners and they become too sweet because the applesauce not only brought moisture, but it also brought some natural sugars. The same thing with pureed prunes, that sort of thing. So if you're going to do that, personally, I wouldn't say 100%. I would do maybe half and half, leave a little half of the oil there and then half with the applesauce. And then I'd reduce the sugar a little bit. A couple tablespoons at least of the sugar to take out. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely what Sheila said. I guess it depends on why you're substituting applesauce to begin with. Are you concerned about the fat? Is that why you want to substitute it? Or are you concerned about something else. So using applesauce, as Sheila said, would increase your sugar. So that may not be what you would like if you're trying to make it healthier and less added sugars. Because adding the applesauce, you will increase your added sugars, you will increase your carbohydrate. If you were preparing it for people with restrictions with sugar, probably not the route to go. If you're restricted as for saturated fat, if you use canola oil, for example, and in fact, even olive oil, which you are welcome to use in the muffin, then you would be using the good fat anyway. But I would consult with your doctor what they would suggest if you really cannot have any fat at all, for example, then you don't have a choice that you would use the applesauce. But as Sheila said, there are some things that might happen. You might have to really grease your maybe paper liner so they don't stick, and then decrease the sugar.
The applesauce trick does not work with cookies at all.
Right. The texture will be completely different at that point. Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing we want to talk about here is how to measure flour, and we have a short video. So if we can click that video over there. Oh, thank you.
No.
I forgot. It's okay if there's no audio. We can just watch it.
Oh, you can't see the video.
Oh, okay.
Hold on for technical difficulties.
Right. Well, it's a good thing we have Corey here. Otherwise, I'd be like, I wouldn't know what to do. Cool. Okay. So a lot of recipes, generally, you would spoon the flour into the cup and then level off at the end there, as opposed to scoop and dip, scoop, and then level off. Okay, so what's the issue with yeast? Oh, sorry. Okay, I have to wait. All right, good. What's the issue with yeast breads? Yeast breads can overproof and result in a heavy collapsed loaf. So just like what Sheila said a while ago, in order for our yeast breads to develop a lot of flavors, we want to have a long time, give it a long time to develop those flavors. And those flavors develop during the fermentation, during that time where it's fermenting. And what can we do to elongate or kind of extend that fermentation period? Just leaving it on the counter, especially on a summer day, or in the summer season, you'll probably have something that will rise really fast. And if you don't bake it immediately, you'll end up with something that tastes slightly sour and kind of alcoholic in flavor and not taste very good. So what you can do is to punch it down or collapse it, give it a couple of folds, and then give it a second rise before it actually gets that really big poofy thing. So before it doubles, you want to actually do a second one. That way you can elongate that or prolong that fermentation period. The other thing you can do is to proof in the refrigerator, because when you put your dough in the refrigerator, then it kind of slows it down. If your dough is about 95 degrees or 90 degrees, it will take probably about 4 hours, more or less, in the fridge before it goes down all the way to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, at which point it will stop the fermentation process, or it will stop rising, basically. So then, and you can even leave it there overnight. Some people even have recipes. You'll find them online that go for 2 days, even 3 days, for your dough. And that's another way that you can prolong your fermentation and get that flavor. With regards to bread machines, Sheila alluded to it a while ago. You could decrease the amount of yeast, add a little bit more liquid, use the longer mixing cycle to develop the gluten. The thing about bread machines is, of course, the reason there's bread machine is for convenience, and you don't have um, much of a control of prolonging the fermentation at that point. So consequently, sometimes, and in my experience, and some of people I know, what they do is they just use the bread machine as a way to knead the dough, but then actually do the fermentation elsewhere, and then bake the bread in the oven. So it's kind of like that. But it still works, given those slight adjustments. But certainly that is the issue with bread machines. With regards to cookies, um, personally, the first adjustment that you'd like to do is to decrease the leavening. And then after that, in my experience, either adding more flour or decreasing the butter. The ratio of the butter and the flour is the one that's kind of tricky. It depends also on what type of cookie you're making. Are you making like a shortbread or a regular sugar cookie or a chocolate chip cookie? Those are all kind of different, and they have their own different ratios. So if we're going to talk about chocolate chip cookies, typically a chocolate chip cookie has a pretty high butter content compared to a regular sugar cookie, and it's really kind of tricky to still keep that flavor, real nice buttery goodness, pretty high in sugar. Of course, if it's not high in sugar, it's not going to be that chewy, nice texture that we want with a chocolate chip cookie. What you can do to prevent it from spreading is refrigerate your cookie dough before you bake them. Also, if you are going in the beginning, when you are beating the sugar and the butter together, make sure that you take out the butter from the refrigerator maybe an hour or so before you start mixing, and don't soften your butter in the microwave. Because if you soften your butter in the microwave and it kind of melts a bit, some parts are melty, some parts are soft, and so forth, then it will that actually is a good way to make it spread if your butter is too high. I read it somewhere, something like if the butter is above something like 82 degrees Fahrenheit, then the likelihood of it spreading is going to be high.
Somebody online just said, my light rolled dough will rise once, but not after shaping. Any ideas?
It depends on the temperature of the dough and the temperature of the room. If it's not rising, when you say it's not rising, it hasn't risen for just the first hour, or it's not rising for many hours, because it will rise after a while. It's just going to be slow if it's too cold. If your house is, say, 68, 65 degrees, it will take a lot longer. If you put it in the oven with just the light on, pretty soon your oven will probably increase to about 85 to 95 degrees, depending on what oven you have. At that point, it will rise quite a bit faster. So if it rose the first time and you didn't add anything to it, then it should rise a second time. It could be just slower because maybe it's gotten cold or whatever it is. The other thing that could happen is if you added something to it that's salty. So salt will kill yeast. So if you added something to it in the meantime, then it might have killed the yeast and it won't rise. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So with regards to cookies, I mentioned we can reduce the leavening a bit, slightly increase the flour. You can also decrease the sugar. And as I said, when you decrease the sugar, just know that the texture of your chocolate chip cookie, especially where you're looking for something that's slightly crisp on the outside, but real nice and soft and chewy on the inside, that's not going to happen if there's a big decrease of sugar. chill the dough for baking, and then experiment with oven temperature modifications. So with regards to cakes, common problems with cakes is that it can rise excessively and fall and sink in the middle. Texture can be coarse, and then it sticks to the pan. We talked about why those happened a while ago as well. Now, what can we do with cakes? The thing that we want to know about cakes is the ratio. Just try to remember that you need about a teaspoon of baking powder per cup of flour at sea level. If your recipe has buttermilk, sour cream, yogurt, or anything kind of sour like that, and then typically they would add baking soda to counteract and create that chemical reaction between the baking soda and the sour liquid. And you would need half a teaspoon of baking soda for every cup of buttermilk or sour cream or yogurt or whatever. So if you're looking at your recipe and it looks like you have too much of the baking soda and the baking powder to begin with, then right there and then it's going to be very tricky. Just like this muffin, where basically you only have 1 cup of flour, but the original recipe actually had enough baking soda, enough leavening for 6 cups of flour. We have enough leavening for 6 cups of flour, the original recipe at sea level. So, and then doing that for high elevation, then we are really in trouble. So just try to remember that you actually only need a teaspoon of baking powder or a 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda for every cup of flour for your cake. Unless you have lots of add-ins there, like for fruit cake, then you might up that a little bit. That's at sea level. At higher elevation, you might want to decrease that by 1/8 of a teaspoon, 1/4 teaspoon, even up to half a teaspoon. It really depends on what you're going for, especially if your baking powder is very fresh. Baking powders these days the formulation these days are different from decades ago, where right now they're kind of a lot stronger, I think. So, but anyway, so that's what you want to do. The other thing is increase the oven temperature. That will help set the cake before the gases expand too quickly, because if you're just letting it kind of just stay in the oven at the nice hot temperature there, but not too high, so the bubbles inside, the tiny bubbles, will just expand. And then pretty soon the texture of the cake is going to be coarse. Increase the number of eggs for richer cakes. This contributes to liquid and strength, just like what Sheila said. If you put in more egg yolks, that'll be richer. More egg whites, stronger, but then kind of drier. Decrease the sugar and fat to strengthen the cell structure. Increase the liquid, and of course, recipe test your cake. Then you can see and adjust according to your preference. So for cakes leavened by whipped eggs or egg whites, such as chiffon cake, angel food cake, and sponge cakes, a lot of this would actually generally require using cake flour, which can be tricky at high elevation, right? So I would say this one is something that you really kind of have to do some recipe testing and experiment. So what you can do is under whip the egg whites. When it says whip the egg whites until stiff peaks form, and when they say stiff, the peak, when you lift your beater or your whisk, it should stand up real straight up, right? But in this case, you want it to be actually kind of droopy right before it's like really stiff. That's when you want to stop. So you want it to give it a little bit of room. Adding an acid like cream of tartar to the egg whites, or using natural cocoa like Hershey's, for example, adding an acid will set up the structure faster, also make the egg whites more stable, the proteins in egg white more stable, and then it will bake faster in the oven and set the structure that helps for these sort of whipped egg leaven cakes. The thing that I want to mention is that chiffon cake is really wonderful to learn at high elevations, because chiffon cakes are like angel food cakes. They're very light, but it has oil. Angel food has no oil whatsoever. Chiffon cakes has oil, and so it's very, it has a tendency to remain moist even at our elevation, more so than your regular yellow cakes. Yellow cakes is made out of butter. And butter, when it's not at room temperature, it feels really dry if it's not at room temperature, if it's in the fridge. But chiffon cake, because it's oil, it's liquid in the refrigerator, it's liquid at room temperature, it's always very pleasant and it's always moist. So chiffon cake is great at high elevation. You can also add a little bit more flour for structure. And here is some pictures of how the egg whites look like. You see the foamy, soft peaks, stiff peaks, and then the over whipped. So the over whipped is when it looks kind of rough already. And in fact, you can see the stiff peaks before it reaches that. It's in between the soft and stiff. That's when your angel, the egg white's what you're looking for. With regards to biscuits, muffins, quick breads, and so forth, we talked about the muffins already. With regards to quick breads, it's basically the same as the muffin. Okay. The difference now is the biscuits. The biscuits, generally the problem with biscuits is that it gets real dry. So especially if your flour has been sitting in your shelf for a while and it's in the winter time and the humidity in your house is like 30%, well, it's going to be really dry at that point. So whatever it says in the recipe, you might have to add a couple more tablespoons of liquid, whatever that may be, for your biscuits or scones. For pie crust, you'll probably notice that whenever it says ingredient for the icy water is 1 to 2 tablespoons, 2 to 4 tablespoons, or something like that, you might end up adding all of those 4 tablespoons because, again, it's really dry where we are. Before I continue, okay, I think it's still me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the other thing that you can do is to prevent a soggy crust, you can bake your pie in the lower part of your oven. You can use a pizza stone and set your pie crust over pie plate right on the pizza stone or baking stone that you may have. You can pre-bake your crust also. Pre-bake it with crumple some parchment paper, put it on the pie crust, and then put some dried beans or uncooked rice, and you can reuse those forever and ever for decades to come. Just keep them, and you can't eat them, of course, after you've used them as pie weights, and then bake them like that. Takes about maybe 20 minutes or so that you can pre-bake them, and then you can add your custard, whether it's pumpkin pie. See, it's already, next week is Thanksgiving, whether it's pumpkin pie or pecan pie or whatever custard that you're cooking for your pie. So because water does not really boil at 212 degrees Fahrenheit here where we are, a double boiler may not obtain the temperature that you need to gelatinize the starch when you're making pudding from scratch. So you might have to use a heavy pan and direct heat instead. Okay, so the only thing we want to remember, we're going to hand over to Sheila.
Well, as we said before, it's success. Your success is trial and error. And we can give you some of the science behind it, but it's your own personal preference. Exactly what altitude you're at is the temperature in your oven. When you set it to 350, was it really 350? Unless you get a thermometer, you don't know. Lots of things can affect this. So we recommend that you do some trial and error, write down what works in the margins of your recipes, and keep them for family heirlooms, basically.
Yeah.
So trial and error really does work there. And Corey, if you could add in the chat now, Corey's going to put in a link that you can go to. This is my favorite publication that CSU has. It's called High Altitude Food Preparation. And in this, you can download it and print it or put it in a file folder on your computer. It talks about the boiling temperature of water at different altitudes. And it talks about how this affects deep fat frying. Did you know that you have to decrease the temperature of the oil when you cook here? In Colorado, if you were to take a recipe from the south, let's say at sea level, and try and deep fat fry, you're going to end up with a burnt outer crust and a raw center. So you actually decrease the temperature of the oil by 2 degrees for every 5,000 feet. So that's important to know. It talks a little bit about microwave cooking, slow cookers. It's got a section in here on candies. And I know we could get a lot of calls this time of year as people are starting to make their peanut brittles and their fudges and that sort of thing. It's the same rule for making those as we did for the hot fat frying, the deep fat frying. You need to decrease the end temperature by 2 degrees per every 1,000 feet in elevation. So I had a gal call this afternoon. She said she tried her fudge 2 times. She was ready to try it a 3rd time. And she was bringing it up to whatever the recipe said, like 234, then putting in the vanilla and the butter and waiting a few minutes and then mixing it. And it was already starting to set and she was getting sugar crystals. It's because she took it too high. She needed to reduce the end temp on her candy thermometer by 10 degrees. Then I said, call me back, see how it worked. Well, she said, she said it was much better, but it's a little too thin. So we were just guessing. We don't really know. She didn't know what her elevation was in Longmont. Do you know what Longmont is? We were just guessing it was around 5,000. I don't know what it is. Plus, her candy thermometer might not have been calibrated, so that's important too, to calibrate your thermometer, whether it's for candy or deep fat frying, but that will make you more successful. Also for canning, it does change things because again, water doesn't boil as hot. So in hot water bath canning, we have to can for longer, and all of the directions are in here. But if you're pressure canning, you have to add more pounds of pressure to the canner. And again, the instructions are online. And then it goes through a section on yeast breads, which we've talked about today, bread machines, biscuits, muffins, quick breads, cookies, pie crusts, and cakes made with shortening versus angel food cakes. So a lot of what we've talked about today is all in this great publication. So do download that and use that. There is a book written by Dr. Pat Kendall. She used to work for Colorado State University. It's called High Altitude Baking. I happen to have the 2nd edition. It might be in a 3rd now, but I believe you can get this at most bookstores or Amazon, that sort of thing. This is great. They are adjusted for altitude. And many times she has a chart in here where she adjusted them for use between 3,500 to 6,000. She goes all the way up to 8,500 feet if you happen to live that high up. So that's a great reference for you to have as well. So here are some other references, not necessarily about high altitude, but good ones for you to have. The first one is the CSU Extension website, where you can look for anything that we have, whether it's animal production, grain production, youth development, cooking, nutrition, all there. The next one is Food Smart Colorado. That one is some great information about nutrition, food safety, and health. Live Smart Colorado blog. We'd appreciate you all going on and subscribing to that. We're trying to get more subscribers, and we write a weekly blog. People like Sheila and myself and all the FCS agents in Colorado, we take turns writing those about anything in family consumer science area, which would be nutrition, food safety, health, finance, child development, aging issues, that sort of thing. Also, ask an expert. I don't think that link is working. I tried it this afternoon. There might have been an error there, but you can go in, just Google ask an expert or ask extension, and you can, from anywhere in the country, put in a question and the expert will get back to you, usually within 24 hours. That's our goal. And then the Home Baking Association has got some great information as well, and recipes. And I think they're one of the ones that has what the end temperature of done breads versus cakes and muffins and that sort of thing is.
Well, I just wanted to mention, if you happen to come across a recipe where they're saying that the end temperature of your bread is now 205 degrees or 210 degrees, and a lot of those are kind of like your artisan type of breads, and you're supposed to cook them all the way to that high, and then you'll have this really dark crust, very artisanal. We're never going to get at 210 at this elevation. You'll be lucky to get 202, 201, because water is only at 230. It's not going to go up. So once you hit that and the outside looks good to you, that's good, because otherwise you're just going to dry it and it's never going to increase.
That's a good point. I didn't think about that. That's a good point. So here's our contact information on both the Sheila Squared there. And so thanks for joining us. And Corey, did you have any final thoughts or questions that came in? Oh yeah, and I do want to thank Claudia. Claudia Meeks is our youth development agent. She's in the back. Maybe we can get her in front of the camera here in a minute. But she's been helping Corey with all the technology today. And it's so great just to be able to do our thing instead of have to worry about the technology. When you have to do both, it's quite stressful. So here's Claudia. Claudia, do you want a taste test in front of the camera? One of these, we'll bring them over here so you can taste test. We can see your face while you're taste testing some of these. Here we have the fail.
The fail looks really good.
Yeah, you're one of those that likes the cookies.
When she was like, this is going to be more moist, I'm like, that's me.
Yes.
What was the name of the book again?
It's called High Altitude Baking, and it's written by Patricia Kendall. She's the editor from Colorado State University Extension. I have second edition. I don't know. There might be a third edition out there by now. And in here, let me just tell you what some of the chapters are so you'll know what all it covers. It has mile high cakes, cookies, bar cookies and biscotti, quick breads, coffee cakes, muffins, scones, biscuits, pancakes, and more, making yeast breads at high altitudes, today's sourdough at high altitude, cookies from a quick mix. And I've made this quick mix up and put it in jars and used it as gifts for people. And quick mixes for cakes, quick breads, and more. And she has nutritional information on all of that.
And the verdict.
And yeah.
They're both really good. You can definitely tell a difference, and I'm like, this one feels heavier. The fail, it is more moist, but I actually think I like the adjusted recipe a little bit better. Even though I do prefer more moist, it just felt really heavy, and I like the lightness of this one, I think.
And you probably noticed when I was mixing this one, I was kind of over mixing it because the order of the recipe, I did it exactly the way it was published online. And it had me mix the yogurt and the baking soda first, and then I added the egg, and I kept having to mix things. I felt like I was going to have tunnels in here, because normally when you over mix muffins, you're going to get tunnels, but there's so much sugar and fat in here.
It won't tunnel because of the high sugar.
Yeah, it didn't tunnel. Whereas in this one, you did it correctly. You changed the recipe, not only the proportions, but you did all your dry first and then all your wet, and then you added them together with very little mixing then later so that you don't get tunnels. And you have a more tender muffin versus a tough one. But this one didn't get tough or tunnely because, man, it's an oil slick in there, huh?
Yeah.
It's like a candy muffin.
So so this was a 425, and you can decrease that to 400 if you don't want a lot of browning on the surface. But as you can see, it will puff up. And if you cooked it, if you added a little bit more for every cup, then you'll have a really domey traditional muffin shape.
Mm-hmm. Oh, put it under here.
Oh. Do we have any other questions? Well, thank you so much. I'd be curious to know where people are coming from. Are we all in the same elevation?
So again, thank you everybody for showing up. We have people from California and all over the country, so thank you so much for making it. And on that note, if you missed anything or had any issues with tonight, feel free to go onto YouTube and you can check out our channel. Again, this will be recorded, so it'll be right up there for everybody too. Also, look out for an email that will be coming your way. We will send the slides as well as another video of what this presentation was. So feel free to click on that link, watch the presentation again. You can use the slides, and we'll also put in the extra link for the extra files that were handed out tonight too. So on that note, thank you so much again, everybody, and go Rams.